Okay, so welcome to our last acid and base video. I know I mentioned we kind of got to the end of acids and bases, but really we got to the end of putting acids and bases in water by themselves. And what we're going to do today is take a look at what happens when we actually start mixing them together. So really to this point, all we've done is we've taken an acid and we put that acid in water. We took a base and we put that base in water. And then we stopped. And that was really all that we had done up until this point. But what we're going to do next is we are actually going to mix them. So we're going to take an acid and a base that are already dissolved in water, so they're already aqueous, and we're going to make them react with each other. So to give you an example, let's say we took something like HCl and we reacted it with sodium hydroxide, so NaOH. Okay, you got to give me a break here. I'm using a mouse pad to do this, so it's a little tricky. When we do that, we're going to get a special type of reaction. And this special type of reaction is called a neutralization reaction. And it's a neutralization because of one of the products that we get is going to be neutral. When we say neutral, we mean it has a pH that is equal to 7. So that's what we're going to get. You can probably predict what that product's going to be already. So here's what we're going to see. When we have a neutralization reaction, like I said, we're going to take something like an acid. You know what I should have done? I should have, let's do the acid in red. Okay, so I take my acid, and then I mix my acid with a base, so I'm going to do my base in blue. And what we end up getting is something that is neutral. That neutral thing is water. Remember, water, pure water, has a pH of 7. We're also going to get something else, and that's called a salt. You know what, we're going to change the color of that too. We'll make that green. So a salt is really just a fancy name for an ionic compound. And it just so happens that in this reaction, we literally get salt, sodium chloride. But it totally depends on what are the ions that are combined with the hydrogen and the hydroxide. Okay? But in every neutralization, this is what you're going to get. In every neutralization, you're going to get a salt, you're going to get water, and you get a solution that is essentially. Okay, so we have this reaction, and it's the same reaction that I showed you on the previous slide. I'm just going to do a little bit of highlighting for you. So we have our acid, which is HCl. It's a strong acid. It's aqueous, so it's dissolved in water. We have sodium hydroxide dissolved in water. It's aqueous as well. And you notice our products, water and salt, sodium chloride. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to write the full ionic equation. So what that means is we're going to break each one of these aqueous compounds down into their ions. So you'll notice HCl, we have now broken up so that HCl becomes H plus, Cl minus. Because it's aqueous, that's what we do. Sodium hydroxide, sodium, and hydroxide ions, because it's aqueous. So the water is going to split those two things apart. Same sodium chloride, sodium ions, chlorine ions, but you'll notice H2O, not an ionic compound. H2O is a covalent compound, so it doesn't actually break down into more than one ion. It just stays as is, and it doesn't break apart. Now, let's take a look at spectator ions, things that don't actually react in this equation. So let's take a look first of all on the right-hand side. Do you notice sodium, Na plus, and Na plus on the reactant side? If it's on both the products and the reactant side, that means it didn't actually do anything in the reaction. It's what we call a spectator ion. Same thing here, Cl minus, get rid of those. What do we have left? What's left is our net ionic equation. And so you'll notice that what's left is H plus, oh, let's not redact that. We have H plus OH minus producing water. That's our net ionic equation. And that's why we call it a neutralization reaction, because in a neutralization reaction, the net ionic equation looks like this. H plus reacts with OH minus to produce H2O. Now, you can have neutralization reactions that actually take place between maybe like a weak acid and a strong base, or a weak base and a strong acid, or even like a weak base and a weak acid. But it's chemistry 30. We're not doing anything super complicated here. We are only going to look at strong acids combined with strong bases. The reason why, because if you didn't have, let's say you had like a weak acid, you react it with a strong base, when it actually neutralizes and you have the full reaction happening, there's still like this weird equilibrium taking place, and you technically wouldn't have a neutral solution. But when you mix a strong acid and a strong base and you get equal moles of each, you're going to end up with a neutral solution. So that's why we're doing this, okay? So if you didn't understand the things I was just talking about, don't worry. It means you don't need to know them, okay? Now, one of the most practical things we do with a neutralization reaction is the lab procedure called a titration. Remember, a titration is when you combine an acid and a base. Actually, let's change our colors again. So combine our acid with a base, and we mix them so they become neutralized. We do this so that we actually get equal moles. That's right, we want moles of acid to be the same as moles of base. And the reason we're doing that is because we are trying to find the concentration of one of these things, right? One of these substances we won't know the concentration of, maybe. And so we mix it with something where we do know the concentration. It's called a titration, and we use that to find concentrations of unknowns. Now, when we actually get to this point where you have equal moles acid, equal moles base, we call that the equivalency point. We call it that for a reason, equal moles equivalency point. Now, this is how we would typically set up a reaction. Remember, in a titration, we're using this special piece of equipment, this thing that is called a burette. So that's what we have right here. This is a burette. Okay. I'm writing with a mouse pad, so this is like, put another T back there. T there. Okay, remember with a burette, we measure, okay, I'm not going to write the whole word, measure. We're going to put measure, and you're going to know what I mean. We use that to measure volume. I'm going to put vol, because again, struggling. Okay, that's what we do with that piece of equipment. We measure the volume of something. But when we're working with it, we usually have the substance that that's inside that burette is what's called the titrant. That is the thing that we actually know the concentration of. That's kind of a key here. Usually the thing that you actually know the concentration of goes inside the burette. And then you'll notice you add it into a solution that's called the analyte. Analyte because we are analyzing it. We don't know its concentration. And so we have an unknown concentration in there. And remember, we will take the thing that we know the concentration of, the titrant, so we know the molarity. We will be able to measure the volume, and using those two things, we can calculate the moles. The next thing we can do is use stoichiometry to find the moles of our analyte. And once we know the moles of our analyte, we will also know the volume of our analyte, because you're actually going to like put a specific amount in this container. And if you know moles and you know volume, you can calculate molarity. Okay, so that's what we do with those two things. So that's the key behind a titration. We start with a substance that we know the concentration of, called a titrant. We add it into a solution with an unknown concentration. We measure the volume as we do that. And then after we finish measuring the volume, we do stoichiometry to find the moles of both things, know the volume of the analyte because you put it in a container, calculate the molarity. Now, remember the one key though is a solution that is an acid and a base being mixed together tends to be a clear and colorless thing mixed with a clear and colorless thing. There's no way for you to know when you've reached the equivalency point unless you use a substance called an indicator. Remember, an indicator changes color depending on if you're in an acid or if you're in a base. And it does this using its own equilibrium. Okay, so one of the most common indicators that we use is a substance that goes by the name of phenolphthalein. Phenolphthalein comes in two forms. It comes in a colorless form. I don't really have a color to represent colorless, so we're going to use orange. And then it comes in a pink form. Oh, that's hard to read. Let's erase that for a moment and let's move it underneath. Okay. Now it's pink in a base, it's colorless in an acid, and here's why. Let's say you add an acid into this solution. The acid will eventually like react with the OH minus that's in the solution, but eventually it like continues to build up, and if enough of it builds up, the amount of H plus in the solution would increase. Whoa. Let's use real color here. So the amount's going to increase. That shifts equilibrium to the left, produces more of this version right here and less of this version over there. What that means is you get more of the colorless stuff, less of the pink stuff. So because you actually are adding an acid in, you're shifting the equilibrium here. Let's say you're adding in a base. Well, a base is going to work in the opposite way. A base is going to decrease the amount of H plus, shift equilibrium to the right, decrease the amount of this colorless stuff, and increase the amount of this pink stuff. Again, it's all the Chatelier's principle coming back at you. Now, there's lots of different indicators. We use different indicators because different reactions will have their equivalency point take place at a different pH range. But we can also use these pH ranges to help us do some interesting work. So you notice like phenolphthalein, it will be colorless at 8.2 or less. It will be pink at 10.0 or higher. Litmus will be blue around 8.0 pH, and it will be red around 5.8 pH. Methyl orange, 3.2 or less, it would be red. 4.4 or greater, it would be yellow. So we can use this to help us find some qualitative pH ranges for substances. So here is some information that we know. Let's say we are given a solution. It turns methyl orange yellow. It turns litmus blue. And it turns phenolphthalein pink. So what is the possible pH of the solution? Okay, well here's what we know. We know that if it turned methyl orange yellow, it had to have a pH greater than 4.4. But then we tested it with litmus, and it turned out to be blue in litmus. So now we know that the pH is greater than 8.0. That's supposed to be a 0. Okay. So now we don't even need this anymore. This doesn't help us now. We know it's greater than 4.4, but we know it's greater than 8.0. So the greater than 4.4 doesn't really make a difference to us. So let's come to the last one. It's pink in phenolphthalein, which means it's greater than 10.0. So now we don't even need this one anymore, because now we know it's greater than 10.0. It's got to be greater than 8.0. So what is the lowest possible pH of this solution? The lowest possible pH of this solution has to be 10.0. And you can see we did that just using some basic understandings of inequalities here. Now, you can't really pin down a pH to a very specific value using this, but you can use it to get a rough idea of what the range of pHs are. And maybe that's good enough for whatever you're doing. You know, you're testing your swimming pool, a range is close enough. You want to make sure it's not 10.0, so you don't burn your skin off when you step into it. You want to make sure it's not like, 2 or less, because then, again, burn your skin off when you get into it. All right, so we know that it has to be, I would say, has to be greater than 10.0. All right, the moment the color changes in a titration is what we call the end point. That's when we end our titration. Now, an important thing to note here, the moles may not be equal at the end point. So the end point and the equivalency point may not actually be the same number. But we use the end point to stop our titration and determine roughly what the equivalency point was. So this is a systematic error that exists within all titrations. Okay. Now, what you see here is a few examples. I'm actually going to do these examples under the camera, and I'll post that in a video for you to watch. But hopefully this helps you get an understanding of the theory behind a titration, how it actually works, and maybe in the future you'll be able to actually perform one. Okay, so check out the video under the camera so that you can watch these examples and see how we would actually work through them.